Beneath the waters today, only foundations remain, and there was no disaster or warning, just a slow disappearance that most people never noticed as it happened. Across the United States there are places like this that ended quietly, and the reasons behind them feel more unsettling the closer you look. Number 10. St. Thomas, Nevada. In 1938, the last residents were forced out. Back in 1865, Mormon settlers founded St. Thomas with survival and community in mind, and over time families arrived, routines settled in, and the town gradually took shape into something stable. Each morning followed a familiar rhythm as people worked and children stayed close by, while evenings pulled everyone back home, creating a life that felt predictable and secure. That changed when decisions started forming far away, and although most residents didn't pay much attention at first, something about the atmosphere began to shift, even before the real cause became clear. What nobody expected was how quickly everything would turn once the 1930s arrived, because a massive dam project began. Water needed space, and that space included this town. Instead of a sudden collapse, the land was slowly swallowed, which meant jobs faded, homes were left behind, and the ground itself stopped serving any purpose for those who lived there. Families didn't leave together, and that drawn-out exit made it worse. As one household moved on, then another followed, until entire streets stood empty and even the last holdouts had no choice but to leave. And this is where it gets worse, because St. Thomas didn't fully disappear, not in the way people imagine, as it now sits mostly underwater but occasionally returns when water levels drop, exposing foundations, roads and fragments of daily life that people pass without a second thought. The strange part is that nothing truly destroyed it. It was simply covered and left behind, and for the people who once lived there, that quiet ending carried more weight than any sudden disaster ever could. And if one town can vanish like that, the next example raises an even harder question. Number 9. Butler, Tennessee. Around 600 families lost their homes here, and what followed didn't just remove a town, it reshaped everything connected to it. For years Butler existed as a steady place where work, family and routine stayed closely tied together, giving people a sense that nothing around them would shift in any serious way. Daily life moved in cycles, mornings filled with work and school, evenings bringing everyone back together, and that consistency made the town feel permanent, like it would always be there. That changed when talk of development began to circulate, and while most residents assumed it wouldn't reach them directly, plans for something larger were already moving forward beyond their control. The shift became real in 1948, and the land itself was claimed for it, which meant the decision had already been made long before many people fully understood what was happening. Almost overnight, the structure of daily life broke apart. As homes could no longer remain, land stopped serving its purpose, and the routines people depended on collapsed under the weight of that decision. Just like St. Thomas, people didn't all leave together, and that slow departure stretched the impact, with one family leaving, then another, until entire streets emptied out, and even those who tried to stay eventually gave in. And this is where it gets worse, because the original Butler didn't survive at all, even though a new town appeared nearby, carrying the name forward but not the place itself. Most people pass through the area today without realizing anything ever stood there before, yet the difference here is that Butler wasn't completely erased, it was rebuilt somewhere else, leaving behind a version that only exists in memory. For those who lived through it, this wasn't just relocation, it was the loss of something they couldn't recreate exactly, and that raises the question of what happens when even rebuilding isn't enough to replace what's gone. Number 8. Judson, North Carolina. More than 300 people were displaced here, and even now not everything from that town ever made it out. Judson existed quietly, without drawing much attention, where work, family, and routine created a steady pace that gave no reason to expect sudden change. Days followed a familiar pattern, with early mornings, nearby activity, and evenings that settled into silence, making life feel stable in a way that rarely invites concern. That sense of normal began to shift when early discussions and distant plans started forming, and although most people didn't see it as a direct threat, the signs were already there long before the real impact arrived. What nobody expected was how final the outcome would be, because in 1943, a dam project required the land, and once that decision took hold, there was no alternative left for the people living there. Almost immediately, the town stopped functioning as it once had, with homes lost, land taken, and routines broken beyond repair, forcing people to face a reality they hadn't prepared for. The departures followed the same pattern seen before, not all at once but gradually, as one family left, then another, until entire sections stood empty, and even those who resisted had no path left to stay. And this is where it gets worse, because over 1,000 graves were moved, yet not all of them were, leaving some still beneath the water where the town once stood. Today Judson remains completely hidden, covered by water and time, with no visible trace for most people passing by to even notice. The difference here is harder to ignore, because while the town itself disappeared, parts of it never left left at all, and that detail changes how the story feels once you hear it. For the people who called it home, Judson was more than just a place on a map, it was their entire life, and knowing that pieces of it still remained beneath the surface leaves a question that doesn't easily go away. And with that in mind, the next place becomes even harder to believe. Number 7. Enfield, Massachusetts. Around 900 people once lived here, and then the town disappeared, a loss that still doesn't sit right with many who know the story. Enfield stood as a small, steady place for years, shaped by routine and a tight community where daily life moved at a pace people understood, and for a long time, everything about it felt like it would last. Families settled in and built their lives around familiar rhythms, steady work filled the days, and mornings unfolded in predictable ways as people headed out while children filled the streets, only for evenings to draw everyone back home again. It felt permanent. That feeling held on until the first signs of change appeared. Quiet at first, just conversations about water and plans forming far beyond the town, which most people assumed would never reach them. What nobody expected was how far those plans would go, and that changed everything. By the late 1930s, the land had already been claimed for a reservoir, and the decision came down as final, leaving no room for negotiation, which meant the town began to unravel almost overnight. Homes stood empty, buildings lost their purpose, and the structure that held daily life together started to break apart in ways people could see but couldn't stop. People didn't leave all at once, and that slow departure made it harder to accept, as one family packed up, then another followed, until entire streets sat empty where life had once been constant. Some held on longer than others, refusing to leave until there was no choice left. And this is where it gets worse. By 1939, Enfield no longer existed above ground, the entire town covered by water and erased from the surface, leaving behind almost no trace for anyone who didn't already know it had been there. Most people today have never even heard the name. What sets this place apart is how openly people resisted, because many never accepted the decision at all, and for those who lived there, it wasn't just a town that disappeared, it was everything they had built their lives around. And that raises a bigger question about how far those decisions went. Number 6. Dana, Massachusetts. This town disappeared before the water even arrived, and what happened next ensured it would be gone completely, in a way that feels even harder to understand. Dana existed as another quiet community, simple and predictable, built around routines that didn't demand change, and a sense of familiarity that made life feel stable. Families lived close together, work stayed steady, and mornings followed the same pattern of school, jobs, and daily routines, with evenings bringing everyone back to the same place, reinforcing a rhythm that felt secure. It felt stable. That stability began to shift when early warnings surfaced, and decisions started forming outside the town, decisions that carried more weight than most people realized at the time. The problem was, those choices had already been made, and none of that could be reversed. Before any flooding even began, Dana had already been disincorporated, which meant it officially stopped existing as a town, and that single move changed everything almost overnight. With no future left there, no reason to rebuild, and no reason to stay, the place began to empty in the same slow pattern seen elsewhere. Families left one by one, streets gradually lost their residents, and even those who tried to hold on eventually reached the point where staying no longer made sense. And this is where it gets worse. Between 1938 and 1939, by the time the water finally arrived, there was nothing left to save, and what remained disappeared beneath it completely, leaving no visible trace and no clear reminder of what had once stood there. Most people will never know it existed. What makes Dana different is how it vanished before it was even submerged, and for the people who lived there, that loss didn't come with a single moment. It unfolded step by step until nothing remained, and that leaves a question hanging about how many places followed the same path. Number 5. Glenville, Ohio. This town disappeared in 1939, and today almost no one talks about it, even though it once functioned like any other small community. Glenville existed quietly, steady and predictable, where people built lives without much attention from the outside world, and followed routines that rarely changed. Daily life moved in familiar patterns, with mornings starting early as work began, children stayed nearby, and evenings settled everything back into calm, creating a sense of stability that didn't draw much notice because it simply worked. It felt stable. That feeling held until subtle changes began to surface, as plans formed and land started being evaluated, though most people assumed those decisions would stop somewhere else. What nobody expected was how directly those plans would affect them. In 1939, the area was selected for a reservoir, and with that decision finalized, the town lost its future almost instantly, setting off a chain of changes that couldn't be undone. Homes were abandoned, land became unusable, and the routines that once defined daily life started to collapse. People didn't leave all at once, and that slow exit made the loss more visible. As one family moved away, then another followed, until entire streets stood empty where life had once been steady. Some stayed longer, holding on as long as possible, but eventually everyone reached the same end. And this is where it gets worse. Today Glenville sits beneath water, hidden and silent, with most people passing by without any idea of what lies underneath, and almost no records left to explain what used to be there. That absence of memory makes it different. For the people who lived there, it wasn't just a place on a map, it was their entire way of life. And now, even that memory has faded in ways that are hard to trace. And that raises a larger issue about how many stories disappeared the same way. Number 4. St. Thomas wasn't the only town lost to rising water. What happened next didn't stay isolated, because the same pattern spread across the country during the 1930s and 1940s as massive projects began to take shape. Dams were built, reservoirs formed, and towns stood directly in the path of those changes, which meant entire communities faced the same outcome. Organizations like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation led these efforts, working toward goals that sounded straightforward, including water supply, power generation, and flood control, but the result carried a cost that wasn't always discussed. And this is where it gets worse. Across the country, more than 1,000 communities were displaced over time, not because of natural disaster or gradual decline, but because decisions were made that required them to be removed. People were forced to leave, land was taken, and everything they built was eventually covered. Most of these places were never talked about again, and that silence makes the next story even harder to understand. The towns beneath the Quabbin Reservoir, where around 2,500 people were forced to relocate, and 4 entire towns were erased. These were not isolated spots, they were full communities built over generations, connected by history, family, and daily routines. Life followed a steady rhythm. Mornings were predictable, work started early, children filled the streets, and evenings brought everyone home. Families had lived there for decades, and everything felt permanent, stable, and unquestioned. Plans for a massive water supply changed everything. The land was chosen, and the decision became final. In the late 1930s, entire towns were disincorporated, homes removed, and communities dismantled. Jobs disappeared, future plans vanished, and families began leaving one by one, followed by entire neighborhoods. Some stayed as long as they could, but eventually everyone had to go, and by 1939 the area was flooded. 4 towns were gone, leaving only the calm reservoir above them. Most people see water and do not notice what lies beneath, but these towns weren't lost because they failed. They were sacrificed for a larger need. For those who lived there, it was more than a town, it was their life. Number 2. The hidden towns beneath Lake Meade. One of the towns beneath Lake Meade had roughly 500 residents, and even today parts of it reappear when water levels drop. These were not isolated towns. They were part of a pattern of communities built in places destined to be submerged. Life at the time worked perfectly. Work was steady. Mornings followed familiar routines. Families gathered in the evenings, and nothing felt temporary. The mid-1930s brought a dam that changed everything. Water began rising behind it slowly but steadily, and homes became unusable almost overnight. Streets emptied as families left gradually. Some tried to stay longer, but eventually even they had no choice but to leave. Today, when water levels fall, roads and structures resurface, reminders of lives that existed and were never meant to reappear. For the people who lived there, this was more than a town, it was their life. Number 1. The towns no one kept records of. Some towns do not even have clear names anymore, and that is what makes them unique. These were small, quiet communities, easy to overlook. Families lived their lives there. Mornings were predictable, work began early, and evenings brought everyone home. Life felt simple and permanent, until surveys and projects started elsewhere, shaping decisions over their heads. Dams were approved, reservoirs created, and entire areas cleared without proper records or detailed histories. Families left gradually, neighborhoods vanished, and even those who tried to resist eventually had no choice but to move. Today these towns are completely forgotten, with no visible trace and no documentation. Most people will never know they existed, but for those who lived there, this was more than a town, it was their life. Final conclusion. These towns did not collapse and were not destroyed by disaster. They were removed deliberately, sacrificed for water, power, and control. Homes were left behind, histories buried, and memories submerged. Most people never heard of them, but every time water levels drop and remnants reappear, it serves as a reminder that these places were real, that people lived there, and that entire lives existed beneath the surface. In many cases, they are still there, waiting to be remembered.